Okay, how's it going, world history people? We continue our discussion and inquiry into whether or not nationalism is a force for good. So I just threw up here the overall picture of what we've been doing so far. And if you look at supporting question 1, we identified what nationalism was. We then looked over at question 2, in which nationalism develops in the 19th century. We looked at Mazzini and the unification of Italy and Germany. And we talked a little bit about how it came out of the rise of the French Revolution and these new ideas that if a monarchy is no longer there, and we're not the subjects of the monarchy and the royal family, then who are the people? Who is running the show? And the show is run by the people now. And so nationalism is an effort to define who the people are. And it's usually based on cultural identities, cultural similarities, or similar belief systems. And again, that's carried out originally in France after the French Revolution, but then also to unify the Italian states and the German states. And we've been continuing to go on to see some of the side effects, and we saw in Russia how Russian nationalism at the end of the 19th century caused the rise of pogroms against Jewish communities. We then debated whether or not nationalism caused World War I, and whether or not nationalism was responsible for the Holocaust on question 5 there, and we've just kind of finished that now. Now the next question we're going to address, and we're almost done here, is can nationalism be a force for freedom? And you'll notice that I made a typo there, but in this question 6, this is what this lecture video will address. And we're going to look at liberation movements in colonial Africa and Asia. So let's take a look at what colonialism means and what imperialism was, and whether or not nationalism could be a force for freedom. All right, so I'll start the discussion with this image. What you have is the British John Bull, who's kind of like a British Uncle Sam for us Americans here. And if you look, he's got his hands all over the world. And this is signifying the fact to the extent to which England dominated political affairs in the 19th century. And it's not just England, it's other Western countries as well. So let's take a look at where this kind of cartoon would come from. The historical phases which we're going to cover in this 10-minute video is the age of imperialism, which is roughly from 1800 to 1914. So this is a time period that we've already kind of covered. It's just going to be a different element called imperialism. We're then going to see the rise of nationalist or movements of nationalism and independence movements from 1920 to 1945. So this is roughly the time period that the movie we just watched, the Swing Kids movie, was taking place. And then we're going to see what's called decolonization, and that's at the end of World War II, 1945, really to the 1980s. So first, the age of imperialism. You should be aware of this term called imperialism. This is when one country dominates the political, economic, and social life of another country, basically taking over another country. And the big picture here is that Europe and or the United States controlled nearly the entire world by 1914. So this era between 1800 and 1914 has become known as the age of imperialism. So imperialism, one country's domination of the political, economic, and social life of another country. In a nutshell, one country taking over another country or region. You might want to know that for tomorrow's quiz. All right, 3 key factors. What caused imperialism? One is nationalism. Of course, it always goes back to this nationalism, but you could argue that nationalism prompted these rival European nations to build empires to be bigger and badder than the other ones. And one way you do that is by building yourself an empire. The other is more economic. The Industrial Revolution creates this demand for raw materials and greater access to resources, and you can go over to a different country, different area, and you can gain access to more cheap raw materials. You then ship that back to the mother country, say England. Your factories manufacture into finished goods, and then you can sell them back to the colonies. So you get access to raw materials, and you expand your market for selling. So the first one, nationalism, kind of a political pride issue. Number 2 is more of an economic factor. And then from a cultural, social aspect, many Westerners, because they industrialized and began to create these democracies, they felt that they had it going pretty well. They had a comfortable standard of living, that they were therefore then superior. And so there was this desire to impose cultures. And this is a tricky one, because many of these people felt they were doing good by uplifting what they call the dark corners of civilization and bringing Africa and Asians to what they saw as their higher standard of living and way of life. And so this included bringing capitalism, but also particularly Christianity, which they saw as the path to greatness. All right, and just to give you an example, Africa is a great example of imperialism's effect. So if you look at the 1880 map, only really on the edges did you have footholds of Europe in there. You have up in the very, very top of the 1880 map, you have Algeria, which was controlled by France, and on the bottom, Britain had a little foothold. But by 1913, the entire continent is carved up by European powers, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia. But the majority of this continent is carved up by the European powers, the greatest of which is probably under French and English control. But beyond Africa, you also had the rest of the world, which was dominated and run by European powers and or the United States. And so by 1914, the world was dominated by the West, meaning Europe and the United States. Okay, so what does this have to do with nationalism as a force for freedom? What happens is these places that are taken over, after kind of regrouping a little bit, after being dominated by foreigners, they didn't want to be dominated by foreign powers anymore, and you have the rise of independence movements, largely fueled by this idea of nationalism. Now, nationalism came from Europe. It's a European ideal, Mazzini and the French Revolution before that, but it's exported to these colonies. And so what you have is the biggest precipice, the biggest catalyst, I should say, that started the nationalist movement was in 1918 at the end of World War I. In order to get the colonial peoples to help fight in their war, many colonial powers, England, France, Germany, they said, hey, look at people in Africa, people in Asia, come fight or work for us during our war, and you do your part and we will give you independence. So during World War I, the European powers had these big empires, and the colonies are brought into the war with the promise that they would get freedom and independence at the end. At the end of World War I, they did not get independence. They felt betrayed. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to give self-determination to all these people, and this seemed like a bitter slap in the face. So after World War I, because the colonies did not get independence, despite being promised by Britain and France and Germany, you see the rise of nationalist movements that rise up in response to Western domination and what they say is betrayal after World War I. And the nationalist movements wanted to establish a strong, modern, and independent state. So you might also want to know what the nationalists wanted in the colonies after World War I. Now, to be sure, it's not like everybody in Africa and everybody in Asia wanted to have a nation. Many of them saw the nation state as an idea of the West, and that makes no sense to people who have more of a religious loyalty or a tribal loyalty. And so you're going to see some problems later on, which we'll address in a different section of this year, where a nation in Africa might not make sense when you have multiple languages and groups. All right, so then this continues on. The fight for national freedom happens. World War II breaks out in Europe, and at the end of World War II, the same kind of thing happens, right? Many nations in Africa and Asia were hoping to get independence from European imperialists. Some did. And so what ends up happening from the 1945 onward is what's called the decolonized period. The imperialists shed their colonial empires. And so you can look, roughly at these maps here, but you can see the various dates. 1945, World War II ends, and you see, like in India, there's 1947. A couple of years later, England gives independence to their India colony, and Africa has various, they kind of shed their empire in phases. Same with Asia. Take a look quickly. In India, you have the rise of a nationalist movement largely led by Mohandas Gandhi. He emerged as a leader of the Indian independence movement in the 20s, and he urges Indians to use nonviolent means to achieve their nationalist goals. His tactics included deliberately breaking what they saw as unfair laws, which is called civil disobedience. In this picture here, they're marching to gather salt, which was important for the survival in the tropical heat. And England... That was a long bell. England controlled the salt in order to control India. They deliberately broke those laws and got it for themselves. He encouraged, in addition to peaceful protests, boycotting British goods in order to hurt the colonial economy of England, but also to prove to the Indians that they themselves are strong and independent and don't need the British. 1935, the British, under this pressure, grant limited self-rule, but not total independence. And the closer they got to self-rule, the tensions between the two religious majorities in India came to a head. Many Muslims feared complete independence because they were a minority, and they were afraid that the Hindu majority would run roughshod over them. And so there's some powers with it. Nationalism tried to unify Hindus and Muslims and say you're Indians before you're Hindu, before you're Muslims. But these old animosities die hard, and nationalism often wasn't enough to bind together. World War II breaks out. Britain committed Indian troops to the war, and they said, look, we will give you self-governing assembly, and we can talk about freedom after the war. The war is over, and we have the rise in protests leading for renewed calls for independence from England. World War II really put Britain in a ton of debt, and they just were not ready to run an empire anymore, and they grant independence to India. But violence between the Hindus and Muslims makes granting independence really, really difficult. And Gandhi, for example, was hoping to use this nationalist pride of India to make them forget about their animosities to each other. It wasn't enough. And in 1947, Britain says, okay, we'll give you independence, but we're going to split the country. We'll have a Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan, which you can see there on the map. As India was largely made up of Hindus, it became the Hindu state. Pakistan was dominated by Muslims, and that became the Muslim state. Although as Hindus leaving Pakistan for India and Muslims leaving India for Pakistan, as they went to their various countries, clashes broke out and millions were killed. It was quite a bloody battle. Nationalists hoped that would not have happened. They were hoping to create a strong Indian nation, but the old religious ties became stronger in many cases. All right, 1947, India becomes the world's largest democratic nation. Jawaharlal Nehru becomes the first prime minister of united India. And despite the bloodshed in 1947, eventually India becomes an independent nation. You could argue that nationalism was the force that gave freedom to India. All right. Indonesia and Indochina, these are examples in Asia. Just to give you some examples here, Asia was dominated by outside powers, mostly for extraction of resources, until about at World War II. So, like India, after World War II, there began to be the rise of nationalist movements in Asia. In Indonesia, which is down here, the Dutch Orange colonies, you have the emergence of nationalism in the Dutch East Indies, and finally in 1949, the Dutch eventually, after a protracted guerrilla war and revolution from the Indonesians, grant them independence. In Vietnam, or what it was called Indochina, the French controlled this region, and under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, pictured up here, you have a nationalist movement develop in Indochina, Vietnam. And the nationalist guerrillas, the nationalist fighters, eventually forced the French out, and France grants independence to what is called Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And of course, the U.S. gets involved in Vietnam, which we'll talk about in a different area. But what you should know is that both nationalism unified the people of the Dutch East Indies and Indochina to fight for independence from their colonial overlord. All right, last but not least, Africa and decolonization. The same story kind of goes through here. In the 1950s and the 1960s, African colonies experienced decolonization and gained their independence. But this independence was fought for under the banner, in many cases, under national independence or nationalism. The Sudanese wanted a unified national Sudan without the control of the British, for example. And so you can see the various dates when these countries finally get their independence. So the question is, can nationalism be a force for good, for independence, for freedom? All right, quick recap. World War I and II creates this promise for independence. The colonies were told by their overlords that, yes, you've helped us fight these wars and we'll give you independence. They did not get them right away, particularly after World War I, and even after World War II, independence kept being delayed. So this sense of betrayal sparks an anger and an outrage that is often voiced in nationalist movements that want to rise up against Western domination. These nationalists wanted to establish strong, modern, independent states where their own cultures could flourish, not English or German or French. All right, so check yourself for tomorrow's quiz. What is imperialism? Why did the world see the rise of nationalism in Africa and Asia after World War I in particular? And can you give at least one example of a region where nationalism was used as a tool for freedom? Good luck.